Good evening. Welcome, everybody, and thank you for joining us. I'm delighted to introduce to you our speaker for today, Kimi Ziemski. In her own words, $100 billion annually is wasted due to toxic culture and bad team dynamics. Kimi knows that this is an opportunity. Kimi Ziemski likes to get things done. She was raised by her grandfather, who didn't think she could make a living studying theater and medieval history. When she moved from parchment scrolls to scrolling screens, that began a long career and generated over 300 million in revenue in telecom. Her grandfather was relieved. That move to tech and leadership long ago showed her that the stresses and the challenges of facilitating conflict resolution in a productive way will meet each other. Then it will either explode, implode, or improve. That's why Kimi works with organizations to improve their productivity by using the talents and capacities of their amazing teams, their amazing people. Her clients drive better schedules and better budget control, 17 and 12% better. This from honing your leadership? Yes. And a critical part of your leadership is how you help your teams deal with conflict. So, Kimmy, let's get started.
Excellent. So let me put this up on a screen share and we'll get going.
Okay. And before we begin, there are just a few housekeeping things, and I'm sure everyone's familiar with our sessions and how we do them on Zoom, but just to kind of be complete, through the session, our audios will be muted for everyone, but we do encourage participation and questions can be entered on chat anytime through the session, and we will address them as feasible, either through this in the middle of the session or at the end. If you would like to enter questions privately just to the speaker, you could do that also in chat and pick the user ZBIG. And Kimmy will be putting that up on the screen very shortly. We highly encourage, because this is a very interactive session, we want everyone to actually be able to interact well. So if you are comfortable, we encourage you to have your video on. We will, in the middle of the session somewhere, we will also have a breakout room, and it would help with that as well. Also, just like with all our sessions, we will be recording this one, and a link to the recording will be shared with everyone registered after the session. So with that, well, Kimmy, take it away.
Thank you.
Sure.
For many of my clients and a lot of my audience, they really love the title of this presentation, but they really don't love the fact that we are still talking about this topic. The thing is, what we found is that when you're in an environment where you can't necessarily just drop in on someone and clear up a little misunderstanding, conflict resolution becomes an even more critical tool. Now, as educators and facilitators yourselves, you've probably been dealing with remote workers and remote colleagues for a little bit longer than some of the folks who've been forced into it since March, and they're not really used to it. So we're going to start with a little bit of a question. How many of you think that you're conflict averse? Okay. And I'm going to, let's see. We're going to launch, which means a poll. Oop, there you go. So, what's your answer to this question? How many of you are conflict averse? Consider yourselves to be conflict averse. Now, I will admit, just like a lot of my colleagues, I have people who have been known to just say, you don't really put those into polls, do you? Yes, I do. I most certainly do. Okay. We've got 80% have voted. I think we're good. So why do you think that is? I mean, honestly, why are so many of us conflict averse? Please put your answer into the main chat because this is an important point. Why are we conflict averse? Okay, that's really odd. I'm getting some comments, not an awful lot of comments. So it is really hard, yeah, to deal with people. And it's easier to live that way sometimes with certain folks, absolutely. Conflict is terribly uncomfortable for a lot of people. And oh my goodness, Pete, that is a question that has often occurred in our media and in our history. So it would be wonderful if we could actually just get along. But interestingly enough, we want to actually look at what it means to have differences of opinion. For example, we're both wearing tops, but Shani is wearing white and
Kimmy,
I'm wearing fuchsia. Yeah?
just your video seems frozen, so
Oh dear. Hold on. It thinks it's on, by the way. Harumph. Okay, hold on a moment. I'm going to do something terribly drastic. This is not one of the things I generally recommend, by the way. And pardon me. So by and large, when we are talking about what makes for a good system, what you're talking about really with conflict is that you are looking at what it takes to actually put together, here we go, we're alive again, what it takes to resolve the fact that sometimes people have differences of opinion, but that doesn't necessarily mean they have to start picking a fight. Sound fair?
mhm.
Okay. As I said, Shani is perfectly entitled to wear, beautiful by the way, white turtleneck. Any reason why I shouldn't be willing or able to wear fuchsia? So essentially what we're looking at is we're looking at a difference of opinion, and that by and large is what conflict resolution is about. Okay. So let's take a look at it from another point. Sometimes people just get very, very nervous about, okay, if it's just a difference of opinion, then we should probably be able to influence the other individual. And this is often when it gets down to the point that conflict resolution starts to become combat. We don't know how much influence we have, and therefore we sometimes accidentally misuse it. We might think we're just trying to get everybody's perspective. The people we're asking might think that we're challenging them, informing them that they're mistaken and we're right. That's kind of difficult, and it erodes our influence. And our influence is actually far greater than you might think. Okay. As a matter of fact, there were some people who did a study on influence. And so I'm going to stop the share for a moment and we're going to do a poll. We're going to close that one. And open a new one. How much influence is measured by how much trust there is? So, in this poll, we're going to ask you to answer the question, how much longer do you think it would take for you to trust a new colleague enough to be influenced by that person, especially in this virtual environment? Okay, so some folks are saying, it won't really take that much longer. And a couple of folks are saying, oh, no, it could take a bit. It could absolutely take a bit. Okay. Please put in the main chat, why do you think that is? And sometimes, by the way, thank you for pointing that out, Shani. Sometimes it also has to do with, are you an introversion preference individual? Are you a highly functioning? However, you also have to deal with the challenges of autism. So there are all sorts of things. It does take time for everyone to get comfortable. We're not getting as much information as we used to, are we? And then also the same level of interaction. And you'll notice that it looks like I'm suddenly not paying attention to you because I'm not looking at the camera. And this is part of the virtual environment, isn't it? But in order for me to read the comments in the main chat, forgive me, I'm still paying attention, but I'm probably not looking at you through the camera. Let's see, lack of personal physical observation and not the same level of interaction. Everything takes more time in the virtual world, in the virtual environment. Okay. And you can't see the body language. Yeah, nonverbal cues, which is one of the reasons why we have asked, please turn on your camera as possible. We understand that it's not always something that everybody is going to be comfortable with, but we really would. That better? Okay, so the test subjects were asked, how many times are you going to have to ask somebody for a really minor request before you get at least 3 to agree to it? And a couple of the requests were, this was extremely minor. Could you please hold my phone for a moment? Would you please help me? I think I have gotten something on my coat. Can you look at my back and tell me if there's anything there? May I use your phone to make a quick phone call? My battery is completely dead. Well, it turns out that they weren't very good at estimating. They only needed to ask 6 people in order to get 3 to agree. The second one was a little more weighty. When asked about how many people they would have to speak to in order to raise $1,000 in support of a charity event, the estimate was that you'd have to talk to at least 200 people. But in fact, it was half. Because you have so much more influence than you realize. Now, I'm also going to point out something. This was not some hokey study. Cornell PhD Dr. Vanessa Bones did this and has been working along the same lines of influence, communication skills, etc. And what we found when we are actually working with some of our clients is that misunderstanding the level of influence that we have with each other has actually exacerbated more conflict resolution attempts into combat than almost anything else, which was something of a surprise. Okay. Now, typically, what we want to figure out is what is the potential impact if we didn't fight with each other? What if we actually managed coming to a productive resolution in an intelligent way? Okay, so we have some suggestions. But before we do, we're going to do another poll really quickly. Okay. All right. What is your answer to this question? Since we've gone virtual, I have absolutely been able to keep my trust and collaborative spirit relationships with my colleagues. They're just as strong as they were before. True or false? Interesting. Well, we've got nearly 80%. By the way, I've rearranged my screen so that I can do this without taking out the share too much. Okay. Do you see the poll results? 75% of us think that we've been able to maintain those relationships, but 25%, they're saying not so much. Okay. So we have 3 tips about this. Tip number 1, tip number 2, and tip number 3. And they're listed that way in particular order because this is the way you can build on the ability to resolve conflict well. Well, that's kind of interesting. Not to worry. So the first tip is connect. Not as human resources. And I feel kind of silly saying this to you folks because no matter what they call it, when you are in charge of making sure that people are being well treated, fairly treated, and that they're able to have an avenue for resolution, you know that they're people. It's the most amazing thing, though. That awareness doesn't always translate to other parts of your organization. And so they forget sometimes to connect just as people. Not that pain in the neck from accounting or, oh my God, here comes that engineer. I wonder if I can run. No, but to connect as people, not titles, not job functions. And that is huge. Tip number 2, collaborate. Conflict resolution is not going to be productive if the idea of conflict resolution is you will be doing it my way. Excuse me? That's not resolution. That's a directive. That's practically handed down from on high. So collaborate. Make sure that you've built a relationship with your team members that helps them to see your commitment to a collaboration so that you can resolve conflicts to get a solution that is bigger than the sum of its parts. Yes? Last but not least, commit. Commit to action. Make sure that whatever agreement you make, even if the first agreement is just to take a breath, take a beat, maybe take 5, that's fine. But commit to it, execute on it, and then do a feedback loop around, because that allows us to regain our connection. There are some folks who believe that once you're done doing it, you're done. No more left. I would submit that some of the difficulties we've been running into have a lot to do with the fact that we seem to have forgotten that we can't tell anymore when someone is done as easily as we could have when we were in a co-located work environment. So here are some of the blocks to productive conflict resolution. Now, when I talk about biases and logical fallacies, one of the things that I find absolutely hysterical is people go, oh my God, she's going to talk about unconscious bias. And seriously, there is this thing about it. But I'm talking to all of you, and I think it's going to be easier for you to understand the impact that different kinds of unconscious bias have. Because I'd be willing to bet many of you actually teach, lecture, or coach on some of them. For example, how productive can a conflict resolution be if someone has an unconscious confirmation bias? I mean, have you ever known someone who just cannot help themselves? They are going to only hear the facts that they believe support their position. Now, it's not as if they just start out the day. Nobody wakes up, I hope. People don't wake up in the morning and say, you know what, I'm going to see if I can absolutely screw with Kalpana's day, but it doesn't matter because I'm right and I know I'm right. And all the data shows that I'm right. No, they don't even realize that they are blocking out information that could dispute or amend the validity of their position. Then there's one of my personal favorites, the Dunning-Kruger effect, which says, if I'm good at this, heck, I'm good at everything. So then, as professionals, we find ourselves in a position where somebody literally is incapable of understanding why they did not get the job that they applied for that was, well, shall we say, a bit of a stretch for their capabilities. Okay. Logical fallacies. At this point, I'm going to ask, could you please put into the chat, and I'm going to go look at the chat now. Could you please put into the chat what your absolute favorite logical fallacy is? You are not seeing the slides. Ah, okay. Let me fix that.
And there's also a question from Peter on the chat, Kimmy. On
Okay, let me get the chat up. Would you do me a favor, Kalpana? Would you bring it up? Would you verbalize it for me? If I look at the chat, if I go access the chat, it's going to take the screen share away again.
No, no problem. Happy to. So the question is about what happens when, as you get to know the person more and as more information becomes available, you find out about the person things that pushes them away. It was better when you thought that that person was really nice, but as you get to know them, you're feeling pushed away, or So what do you do in that situation? I think this is about the relationship that you were talking about, that to kind of help with conflict resolution. So if you can.
Peter, I'm going to give you an answer that when I delivered it to a client quite recently in exactly that position, it stopped her cold. I said, all due respect, you're not in your position to make friends, and neither is the other individual. It would be great. And it's a wonderful bonus if you're able to develop friendships in the workplace. But we're there to deliver results. We are there to fulfill certain obligations that we have to the organization in return for that paycheck, which means there are going to be people that you're going to have to work with productively that you might not ever want to invite to your home for dinner. But maybe what we need to do is reframe how we're looking at that individual. Is that individual competent? Are there biases or perhaps mental boundaries stopping them from being productive? Now, that is an issue. If it stops them from being pleasant to work with, but they are still productive, well, we do what we can to make sure that we are the adults, that we are the professionals. We lead by example, because if we play into those particular personality traits, thought patterns, or logical thinking habits that are actually quite out of whack, if we play into the frustration that that causes for us, then we could actually have created our own little bias of overlooking anything productive that that individual can contribute. So what it boils down to is this: start viewing that individual as a team member and a participant in your professional endeavors, but not necessarily as friend material. Keep it adult, keep it professional. Under all circumstances, absolutely stay cordial, but nobody expects you to be best buds. Ask that individual to perhaps be the godfather to your next child. Okay. One of my worst nightmares happened when it turned out I had a team of 12 people and none of them liked each other. The only thing that various parts of that team had in common was who they disliked more. That was the time that I started to institute something that is a little archaic in project management where I live, but it is incredibly valuable. And many times we call it ground rules. And here's what it was. I have 3 expectations. You'll be civil, you'll be a professional, and you will be an adult. You don't have to want to invite me to your house for dinner, and I don't have to want to invite you to dinner. But ultimately, we need to deliver results. Peter, does that answer your question?
Yes, it does. I'm sorry, I was on mute.
Oh, isn't that irritating?
I'm
Not
talking
only
to the
that,
screen and no one's hearing me.
and nobody's responding, and we're still looking at you like, okay, any minute now. It's starting to get more complicated, the technology, isn't it? Because honestly, it's been kind of bizarre. I've had 16 clients and students over the past 2 weeks who have bought fancy dancy new headsets that have a mechanical mute. So not only do they need to mute on the platform
Oh my God.
and unmute, they have to unmute from their mechanical mute. So we sometimes are trying to do our level best, but it doesn't help. We are still causing a little bit of a difficulty. Okay. I've just taken a look at the time, and out of respect, I'm just going to keep moving along. Okay. So ultimately, conflict resolution has to do with the level of trust, the level of transparency, and the level of clarity that you have with all of your team members, and the type of team culture that you have built that encourages certain basic principles. Okay. Make sure everybody actually is speaking the same language. There's even a book about that called The Americans and the English, two people separated by one language, except we do speak American and they do speak English, and sometimes it's weird. I get the funny feeling sometimes that engineers coming from all over the world have better clear definition because their technical training is what they're going to deal with primarily in those conversations. Make sure that people have ownership of what their responsibilities are, not just on the technical aspects or the operational aspects of their jobs, but also their responsibilities as team members to keep alive a collaborative spirit that reaches out. Cooperative spirit waits. I mean, if you were to call on me, absolutely, I am there for you. But collaborative spirit reaches out and says, is everything okay? I just got a change on this part of the project, but I didn't see your name on the distribution list. It was probably an oversight. So I just wanted to share it with you, and then give me a call. And any questions that we have, we should probably go back to the person that sent out that email. Collaborative spirit is reaching out. Cooperative spirit is, sure, I'm with you, but not until asked. In our jobs as educators and facilitators, we probably have one of the strongest understandings of anybody in the organization of interdependency, because we see it on the ground. We don't just see it as an interesting concept for how different parts of the organization are supposed to work together. But in a team, interdependency is not just about the work. It's also about who we are as people and what are our priorities. I have had the honor of leading teams for several decades, and I've never gone a single year of leading teams where someone hasn't had their personal priorities completely get thrown up in the air and upset the order of their professional priorities. And we're seeing a lot of that. So understand that kind of interdependency as well. All of those facets create the dynamics of a team culture that is either going to be productive or not. Okay. Look, one of the most annoying parts of conflict, those differences of opinion, is that frequently we don't see how it was actually planted a long, long time ago. And when people have expectations that are disappointed, that's a good way for a difference of opinion to turn into a fight. But if we're communicating well enough at the beginning of relationships, at the beginning of every new effort, so that everybody understands what the expectations are on all sides, then it's a little bit easier to have any differences of opinion resolved based on a common understanding of what the framework was of the expectations, what the framework was for understanding what we were being given to resolve any kinds of issues, and where perhaps that might have fallen short. It makes it a whole lot easier. So, how can you do that? How can you, in fact, level expectations and make sure that everybody is sharing the same expectations? We want people to stretch, but how far? Would you please put in the chat what you can do to uncover the expectations that your team members have? I'm looking. Kalpana, could you tell me what kinds of responses we're getting? What have people done successfully in the past to uncover expectations?
Sorry, I was on mute. Okay, so we've got ask a few times, ask questions, ask empowering questions, open huddles at regular times, and one that we've got says, listen.
Okay, whoever wrote that, you are now, quite frankly, my favorite. It is really important. You can ask the questions, but sometimes in the heat of just trying to get through the day, we don't always listen as closely as we could to the answers. And to the point that was made earlier, we have a lot less data to work with nowadays. Sometimes all we have is the expression on their face and the tone of their voice.
Right, and sometimes people may not be open to discussion, Kimmy, so there's one input of that line. Use anonymous input first, then small group discussions and individual meetings.
I love that. And you know what? For a long time, people said, yeah, right, anonymous surveys. They really are anonymous, largely because the people who write them and present them as anonymous are ethically bound and technology enabled to make it truly anonymous. I do something like that in my classes. At the end of every day, I'll ask the students to please text me the answers to 3 questions. Why? Because they're not in my phone book. And none of the 3 questions are, what is your name? So it's completely anonymous. And then we'll do a quick run through of a feedback loop of those results the following day in class. Interestingly enough, because it was originally anonymous, and I don't try to attribute it to any particular person, even though sometimes, let's face it, we all have a sneaking suspicion we know who wrote that particular comment, but I don't attribute it publicly. And very often an individual will say, okay, you know what, that was me. And here's why that was such a point for me. And it opens up the conversation. Because once they find that they're not getting an arrow shot in their back because they were the messenger who delivered an unsavory message, it established a little bit more trust and a little bit more safety so that they can do it. And all of a sudden, the conversation becomes richer. Remember, we consider active listening to be also called, in a lot of text and a lot of research, whole body listening, because you're watching, you're absolutely listening, but you're watching, you're thinking, you're trying to make sure that any metacognitive processes that are going on are along the lines of, okay, do I really understand where that particular comment came from? Oh, I didn't realize that. Could that perhaps be the reason for X. Because the time that you spend at the front end of this is time that you don't have to spend fixing it. And sometimes when differences of opinion explode into fights and combat, sometimes you can't fix it. I know. I'm supposed to come in and tell you how to fix everything. Yeah. I don't have wings. I don't have a magic wand. And I don't have any expectation that anybody on this call isn't smart enough to know that nobody can fix everything and that some situations can only be tempered. They might not be fixed, not on your watch sometimes, not under the current circumstances. So I'm not going to tell you that it always can. But there was a wonderful fellow by the name of Barry Beamer who did a study and found, at least in the kinds of projects that I work in, which are largely organizational and IT, that the dollar that you spend in planning and preventing is worth $200 to $2,000 that you won't have to spend trying to fix things. I don't know what your portfolio looks like, but I'm good with that kind of return on investment because ultimately your time and talent, just like the time and talent of everyone else on your team, is currency. But is it in the shape that we can use it or have old habits of conflict non-resolution cause that currency to be completely unusable? I'd like to stop the share now. And by the way, these slides are already PDF'd to Oliver, Alex, and Kalpana so that you can get the slide information. But I'd like to find out, if you would, and I'm going to move this over. What kinds of questions you might have for now? Oh, grading final exams. My goodness, I feel your pain. I'm tempted so often to just do exams as multiple choice, but I know it's not the best way to measure learning. Does anybody have any questions on some of the points that we've touched on today?
So sometimes, as part of you trying to resolve a conflict, if you are running into like personality issues, right, where you may have tried, you believe in your best ability, and you finding that there's some kind of personality trait where someone is, not able to come to terms, like basically meet you halfway. Any
They won't
suggestions?
even meet you a third of the way.
Yeah. Any suggestions?
Yes, I'm a big fan of peer reviews. Go find someone who is not invested in the conflict, in the difference of opinions or the differences in approach. Go find someone who's not invested in it, either from the other individual's perspective or from yours, and run it by them. Just because we've tried our darndest doesn't always mean that we've tried everything that we as individuals are capable of. And sometimes because we've gotten into sort of a hamster wheel of action, reaction, action, reaction, action, reaction, we don't even remember what we're capable of. And as a result, that means that sometimes we've completely forgotten about successful tactics and approaches that have worked in the past for us because now we're in that hamster wheel of action, reaction, action, reaction. And It can help to have a new pair of eyes on it. It is my opinion that very few people go to try to find a mediator in the situation in a timely fashion or in a well-constructed approach. Because if you're going to go get a mediator, you don't go get your boss or their boss. You go get somebody who doesn't have skin in the game, as they say. You go to somebody whose only objective is to resolve that difficulty. And that's actually one of the reasons why so many facilitators, coaches, and educators and human resource specialists find themselves in the position of actually being asked to mediate, because the perception is you guys, we care more about resolving the issue in a productive fashion than we care about either one of, or in some cases, any of the 5 or 4 who are involved in that conflict and who need to be a part of resolving that conflict. So absolutely, go get a mediator sooner than you think you might need one, but only after considering, number 1, will that other individual agree to work with a mediator? Number 2, how am I going to find one that literally shares only our objective to solve this conflict, who doesn't care where the solution comes from, as long as we're able to craft it together and we agree to take action on it? Remember, connect, collaborate, commit. Every conflict resolution, every negotiation ends up with an action list. Sometimes, though, organizations find they're having to reconnect and re-moderate, renegotiate the same conflict issues over and over again. And it's because of tip number 3. People shook hands, they walked out of the room, and then they didn't actually follow through on their commitment, and we didn't hold them to it. Let's see, somebody, the advice I have for working with someone who's a high achiever in actual deliverables, but is terribly unpleasant to work with, is going to be very blunt. Go find an ally in the leadership team who understands the toll that this is taking on the productivity of everybody else. Because the glint and glimmer, the shine and sparkle of deliverables that are awesome will cause some people sometimes in the leadership team to not realize the toll it's taking on everybody else in the team. And therefore, that one individual's positive contribution is actually costing the organization the potential contributions of 10 or 15 people. Because we don't share our despair. We don't, we do share our despair. We don't always share a sense that we can do something about it, which is odd, because very frequently you'll find in that environment, everybody's got pretty much the same idea of what's wrong here. But you're going to need backing. You're absolutely going to need backing. How do you get coworkers to work together when one of them sees only black and white and the other one likes to work in the gray area? Oh, you're quite welcome, Amy. Well, Pete, it depends on why they're doing that. I always joke that, and okay, you guys tell me if I'm wrong about this. If I have a room full of engineers, I will not get a perfect score on my evaluations. I could have rocked the house. We could have gone out of there with amazing deliverables, action plans, and follow-up plans, and they are jazzed, and they still will not give me a high rating. Why? Because they're problem solvers. They've been trained to look for where it could be better. And God bless them for it, okay? Don't get me wrong. I am literally on my third partner who is an engineer, so clearly I understand that that's worth it. But understanding why somebody is approaching a particular situation is going to be the key to being able to figure out how we can find that common area that will allow each of them to give a little, to be flexible a little bit more. Okay. So Pete, I would suggest find out why they're looking at it like that. Did that answer your question? And he's thinking, no, gosh darn it. I was hoping for some very specific steps. Any other questions?
I think there's one more. After you resolve a conflict, do you follow up with participants later on?
I absolutely do. I absolutely do. And it's even more important if I didn't have to broker the agreement as the team lead, if they were able to come to an agreement together and I know, and they come to me and say, okay, this is what we're going to do. It turns out that part of Jane's approach is perfectly valid, but you know what? Part of Michael's was even better. So we're going to do this, this, and this. And I will ask them up front while everybody's in the same room. Okay, at what point will you have a status about whether or not that's going to work? And they'll tell me. And a few days before that, I'll check in and say, how's it going? Did any unexpected roadblocks occur? Did you learn anything new that you could also incorporate here? But without that commitment, again, you know, connect, collaborate, commit. Without that commitment and that example of the kind of commitment that you're frankly looking to, you know, you're looking at them and that's what you're looking for. Without a demonstration of that commitment, well, it's a little tough to keep telling people that they need to take action when they don't see that you're committed to their success just as much as they are. And you will help them by making sure that they hold themselves accountable. It's not my favorite job, by the way. So I love it when my team members start to get to the point where they're doing a lot better at holding themselves accountable. Take care, Pete. Thanks. We're also running, if I'm not mistaken, right to the end of the meeting.
Right. And I don't believe we have any more questions. So this was wonderful. Thank you very much, Kimi, for your very insightful discussion on resolving conflicts, which I'm sure everyone finds themselves in those situations often. So thank you.
Well, thank you for being such wonderful hosts. And if